So, I guess we'll start without Dorian Mark, who is trapped somewhere in the public transport system. But hopefully he'll join us later on. But since Jana is sick, so she won't be joining us at all. But I can happily welcome Alexander Bard and Steven Dixon, who is here to talk about these 5 statements which we have prepared. But first I will present Alexander Bard, who is a Swedish artist, music producer and writer, and he's also a very active debater and writer, lecturer and politician.
I don't know if I'm a politician, I seriously doubt that. No, but I write books. I've written 3 books, and they've just been released in the States under the name the Futurica Trilogy, because what I do is that I mix philosophy with future studies in my work. So that's what I do, and I'm tied to the Stockholm School of Economics. That's when I'm a grown-up. And then when I'm a child, I'm a music producer and an artist because I enjoy writing pop songs. Very silly.
And Steven Dixon has a doctorate in philosophy and is working as an art theory teacher and lecturer and writer and artist at the Bergen Art Academy. And you're from the US, and that's why this is is done in English.
I apologize for that. Everybody has to keep up with me.
Yeah.
Is there any other just English speakers here? Okay, good. You have to keep up with me. That's great.
But as I said, we have prepared some statements for you, and we would like you to discuss these from your own or different point of views, and then if you could reach some sort of agreement to these point of views, then we would like to see that happening. Or you can, of course, just agree to disagree if that is what it is coming down to. And I won't be acting as a moderator as such. I will keep track of time, and I will look if there is points of views from the audiences, and you can feel free to raise your hands if you want to add something or state a question or so on. And yes, I think we should just get started then. And our first statement is that all art is propaganda.
Yes, I'll answer yes to that. And if I could just do a little history here. The 20th century saw art kind of move into the idea that it was some sort of communication. The meaning of the art piece was important, and not just the physicalness of it. And that definitely happens in the 80s, where representation happens. So the meaning. And so in some ways it wants to communicate an idea to you. It wants to persuade you of that. There were some problems, though, with that is that this single point of view was the narrow down, the one meaning is the propagandist element of it. And art wanted to break that, and then we had relational aesthetics and all that, where they actually try to disrupt the propagandist notion of it. So even though I said yes, it's been problematic. And also the idea with the propaganda nature of it is that there has to be a single meaning to it. It has to be agreed upon. And then you get things like the museum structure, or critics, or art schools, whatever. So those things want to narrow it down to one thing. So conceptual art, installation art, relational aesthetics, all of this stuff want to break it down, to have multiple meanings. So they try to move against it, but that re-galvanizes the art piece to move it into a different propagandist position, of course. There's going to be another person that says, oh, here's the meaning of it. So that was a long explanation of saying, yes, all art is propagandist. It wants to give you a meaning, but art wants to work against that simultaneously. So.
I enjoy listening so much to Steven, so you don't mind if I just pick up the ball and just, boom, boom with it and then throw it back on his half again. So, yeah, if you don't mind, we play a little ping pong. Well, as long as there's just 2 of us here, why don't we make an advantage of that? So, there's supposed to be 4, but there's only 2, so at least more room for both of us. And for more ping pong. Well, the problem with this, with the question, is of course that we have two abstracts here. One is art and one is propaganda, and we have to define these two before we actually say yes or no to the statement. I would say yes, definitely. There's a propaganda element to all art, and often it's subconscious rather than conscious. So there's definitely an element of that. I think as long as we think of art as something that's generated by, it used to be an individual, the auteur. These days it's more and more a collective effort. We're moving into an era where art, like everything else, is becoming more interactive. And when things become more interactive, it's rather a group of people, like a sect, who are behind a piece of work, rather than a traditional individual. I would say that art is becoming less individual, more individual in the sense today. But I still think at the end of the day we have to be honest here and realize that as soon as something we are doing is meant to be perceived as artistic in some way, then there's always going to be a group of people behind that trying to communicate to another group. And although they might be interested in a dialogue, and although they might have the very best intentions to open up for a dialogue, and dialogue here is the opposite of propaganda, there will still be an element of, okay, there's an hypothesis involved with this. We're trying this. We want to make a statement. We want to define ourselves. We want to create an identity for ourselves as a sect when we do this. And as soon as you do that, you also have a goal. You have a purpose. You want to achieve something in the audience that you have in front of you, rather than in your partner of communication. And I think that element is still there, even in interactive art. At the end of the day, it's going to be a group of people communicating to what is perceived as another group of people. And in that communication, it's going to start off with, okay, here's an hypothesis. Well, that's where the propaganda element always is. We want you to believe something. That's what propaganda is. Propaganda is what communication and PR agencies do these days. And they specialize on it unashamedly, and they get paid for it. And basically, they're telling you what to say to achieve what you want to achieve. To get people's minds somewhere from A to B, you're going to say this. That's what propaganda does. And that element is there, and used creatively and honestly, I think it's a very strong element in art, and a very important element, and a very creative one.
One thing. I think it's not actually this one thing. You can do this one thing, but this narrowing down of this image, this idea, works and mitigates against the galvanization of art, if I can use that term. That lively art that actually exists, that's communicating in a dialogue with the world. So in some ways, that's, you want to say this thing about it being narrowed down to one thing, and that's what it should do. And sometimes political art will do that, to take a contra-oppositional stance to, for instance, capitalism. But generally, I think in order to escape this notion, that's where we get this multiple interpretative models of art. So a little bit, I agree with you most of the point, but that's where, in some ways, the art isn't a PR move. It's something that's saying, and there is one, I'll mention one person, and maybe you're going to mention ritual later in these questions. Okay, because believe it or not, Walter Benjamin, in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, everybody probably knows this essay. He talks about aura, but what he talks about is the sacred in art being the problem. That the sacred in art meant, in this thing you have a certain ritual that the art goes into, for instance, the art world or whatever. It narrows down the meaning. But what he was visualizing is an idea that when the artwork is exposed, every person that views it has an individual interpretation. Every single one. Meaning is totally broke open. So this is really when he says the destruction of the aura, he's not really he's just saying this kind of weird setup that goes on to make it have something. But what we want to do is have an art piece where every individual that sees it has a meaning construction, and all of those are equally valid. So it's sort of interesting because it's exactly the opposite of what a PR wants to do. So that's what I just wanted to say. If this is really what art is going to do now, and it's funny that Benjamin does this kind of weird relational aesthetics so early, But if you read the essay, you'll see that this is where he kind of goes with this whole thing. I'm sorry if I jump to one of the next questions.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think this is historic. I'm a Hegelian myself, so I like history. And I think things move. There are movements over time. There's thesis, there's antithesis, there's synthesis, etc. And I think we're at a very interesting stage. This spring, both a rightist pop philosopher like Alexander Bard in Oxford has published his new book, and the new book is called Religion for Atheists, where he propagates for the idea of art replacing traditional religion, but religion returning as a religion of the arts. Basically, the Bouton's idea is that we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we threw out religion. We should have thrown out theism and not religion. And religion is not really about theism at all. Religion can include both theism and atheism, as any Indian or Chinese person would know, but most European people don't know. And so he propagates in his new book for the need of religion to return as an atheist religion, meaning it's credible for modern secular people. But they have this need. And he obviously places art, psychoanalysis, and psychology as sacred activities that were replacing the old priesthood and the old priesthood activities in churches and things like that. And he wants to build a cathedral for this. The interesting thing, though, is that on the other side of discourse at the moment, Slavoj Žižek's new book is coming out in May, and he's finally got hold of his ADHD and actually written less than 3 books in a year. He's actually spent 5 years on 1 book, which means it's probably fantastic. I haven't proofread it yet. But Žižek's new book is called Less Than Nothing. And Žižek's theory is that, having traveled the world as a sort of philosophy superstar for the past 10 years, especially of the left, Žižek came to the point, which you do as a philosopher, sooner or later you have to take your audience and its questions seriously. It's not just the end of your speech. So the audience, you realize there's a question the audience always asks you. And the question the audience always asked Žižek for the past 10 years is that, what do we do with communism? Where is the room for the communist utopia in contemporary society, where the standard liberal democratic answer is that communism is impossible, it's been tried, it didn't work, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that's not an historical given at all. Hegel would be totally against that idea. He would say that, of course, communism is probably more possible than ever when people don't think it's possible. So Žižek believes this firmly, and so he wants to place communism in a credible environment where it can actually expand as an idea. And he realized finally he had to write the book himself and spent 5 years writing it. And what he did was that he took Hegel and applied Hegel in contemporary society as a social critique. We really need the Frankfurt School these days, especially in the internet age. You know, we need Walter Benjamin to write about the internet, definitely. But anyway, what Žižek then does is that he goes back to St. Paul, obviously not St. Paul's religion, which he hates. How can you not hate Christianity? But he loves St. Paul as an organizer. And the organization theory of St. Paul, which basically, if you summarize it in one sentence, is that we live in the age of empire. It's no longer the Roman Empire as it was 2,000 years ago. It's the global empire. Ironically, one of my books is called The Global Empire, exactly for that reason. We live in the age of global empire, and the only way to oppose the empire and the forces of empire is to construct tiny congregations of opposition. Congregations of resistance, close-knit congregations that live the communist utopia. And by living it, they then become models for others to copy, and eventually they can take over the empire, which was St. Paul's model, which worked. And this is so that's why Žižek has dug into theology, created an atheology, an atheist religion based on that. And I find it very, very interesting that on 2 different sides of discourse, we have this sort of glamorous TED Talks type pop philosopher in Oxford, Alexander Bard. And on the other side, we have Slavoj Žižek, one of the heavyweights of the left. And they both come out with books the same spring, and independent of each other, both with the same idea of atheist religion, both being a need in a liberal democracy, Alexander Bard, and being the new possibility of resistance and opposition, which is Žižek's idea. And I find this very, very interesting. And both people, of course, these 2 men, place art in a very, very central function here. So Walter Benjamin has a lot to deal with if he'd be around. The sacred returns with a vengeance, in a Hegelian move. And the sacred of art is then more important than ever. And if we look at, for example, early adoptions of these theories online, like the Church of Atheology, which is a project that I love, The Church of Anthology is being launched around Europe this summer with festivals, with clubs. The techno scene is very dominant, the music scene definitely, but always with artistic performances as a centerpiece of that movement. And I think this has the potential to be huge. It's very, very fascinating because it's grassroots and it's taking art seriously and it's very heartfelt, it's very communicative, it's very interactive, and it's outside of the traditional art discipline. It's outside of... There are no galleries with white walls involved. There's no such investing in it or anything like that, and that's exactly why I love it so much at the moment.
That was propaganda.
Should I answer? There is a bit of an answer I have here, but
Yeah.
I mean, I was wondering about this idea that if you think of art as propaganda, that perhaps just reduces it to a sort of idealist hermeneutic question of meaning, and the actual object of the artwork can drop out of it completely. And then I was sort of wondering about, this could relate to this sort of Hegelian tradition of Kantian critical philosophy, where Kant is placing a limit on the realm of knowledge, and he sort of excludes the noumenal, the object itself. And maybe this is what, so Kant leaves this up to God in a way. And maybe the sacredness of art is nothing more than the materiality of the object of art, pre-critical understanding of it as some sort of phenomenal hermeneutic discourse.
Well, I can reply quickly to that, and then Stephen has something more to comment. To begin with, I only said propaganda as an element of art. I didn't say art is propaganda at all. Not at all. It's actually a minor element of art. And there's far less propaganda within art in general than there is in communication. The communication PR agencies, they're doing 100% propaganda. That's a different story altogether. Art is actually a possibility of resistance against propaganda, to me. But anyway, to go back to your question, I would say that if you think of phenomenal and nominal in this sense, then being an Hegelian, definitely I would say that the sacredness is transcendent, that sacredness is something we apply to art. It's not in the art itself. And I wouldn't even use the word object when I speak of nominal. Object is phenomenal. Object is what you create. Object is, for example, in modern physics, object is the particle aspect of material. But the field aspect of material is the nominal, because we can't understand field. It's impossible to understand field in a human brain. We're not programmed to understand that. We can only understand particle. And particle is the essence of what an object is. It's the smallest possible object.
I was going to come at it from the language theory point of view, but he came from the quantum physics point of view. So, object has been the problematic, of course. And interestingly enough, now for those that want to know about this postmodernism, is there a possibility of the return of the real? Can you get to the object? And I think probably the most interesting, I hate to quote, and I apologize for this, if those that are interested, is Deleuze's cinema theory books. He tries to think that there is a possibility, there is a world. It just is so multiple that there is no way to decide what it is. So he moves in both directions. That's kind of a having your modernism and postmodernism and eating your cake too kind of thing. So he uses Leibniz's monadology theory. But I hate to go off on all this stuff. But see, the question is it possible to get to the real world? Or do you only go through language? That's the question. And of course with Kant, he's kind of doing the same thing. You have to go through the categories. You could do this judgment thing. You look at art, oh, I can see the judgment of it. I can see the beauty of my judgment. So it's so wonderful. But does that get you anything, is the question that we have to live with here. So to kind of answer your question and contextualize it a little bit. But so the point is postmodernists think all experience is mediated by language. There is no immediate experience, therefore you cannot have an object. You only have a constructed object. So I think there's some attempts to try and get there, but nothing has worked after the postmodernist theory, I would say.
Well, maybe that's another version of the work of artwork.
Well, process. Yeah.
Well, why would we want to get to the real to begin with? I find that idea very childish, but I'm an Hegelian. I'm perfectly happy with my ideas. The only problem I have with ideas that are far more beautiful than reality to begin with is that we sometimes walk into walls. So that means the only reason we have to even think of a world outside of our ideas is because we could die by walking into walls. So we have to know where the walls are. And in that sense, I'm interested in my fantasies being corrected now and then, in a Lacanian sense. But there's no way to go beyond fantasy, and why would we? What's the point? That's exactly what was the problem with modernism. There was this idea all the time that if you only found out what reality was like, if you only through science could find out how things really work, and then contemplate that somehow and get it into our minds, then that would be beautiful. And I'd say it's the other way around. That's horror to me. There is a word for actually using your senses to absorb the world around you, and the word for that is psychosis. That's exactly what happens when your perception stops working. Your perception is supposed to take away 99.9% of what your senses let into your brain. And if they don't do that, that's psychosis. And if you get psychosis, you stop functioning altogether. You're no longer a human being. You're just a mess. So to me, I actually love the idea of ideas, and I prefer to stay in the world of ideas as much as possible. I love fantasy, and I defend fantasy as a Hegelian.
But maybe you want to move on now.
Yeah, I
Is there
think
any
it's
more
about
questions,
time.
though? This is a very fascinating subject. I hated to.
I have a question about this. I have a question about this movement that Alexander talked about, where art is like a central part of the new movement. And is that like is it the creation of art, or is it the, like viewing art? I mean, I would like to see it as everyone can create art, and that's the importance of it. That through experiencing the world and trying to express it through some means, you understand the world better, and that's the point of it.
I think we need to put ourselves into history and know where we're at. We're at the end of what I call hyper-individualism. And we're getting very, very, very tired of it, thank God. Because we're left to consume. This is Zizek's general Frankfurt Schoolish critique of contemporary society. All liberal democracy left us with after we were all allowed to speak our minds is basically consume until you die. And that's all you can do. You're homo consumus, and there's nothing else for you to choose. And I think we're tired of that, and we're looking for an excuse to go back to the collective, to find the social arena again. And this is being driven by a huge new force in history that didn't exist before, and that's the internet. The internet is one of the four biggest revolutions in human history. It's now taking over the world. And the internet is an instrument that actually endorses us to be social. So we're completely fucked up in our minds today, because we are, on one side, we live in a consumerist society that says that you should hate yourself as much as possible, because the more you hate yourself, the more you consume. The more frustrated you are about your weight, the more frustrated you are about your lack of a career, the more frustrated you are with the terrible sex partners you have and everything else, the more you consume. And we all know this is like basic psychology. People consume when they're frustrated. So the market endorses us to be hating ourselves and then hating others. Whereas on the other hand, there's this longing for social belonging, and the internet works in a very funny way. It's an instrument that only rewards social activities. It doesn't reward you for being a big ego. Nobody will follow you if you walk around and being narcissistic in that environment. So we have this other force jumping onto the historical stage that wasn't there before. And we have this huge collision between a bourgeoisie and an autocracy. We have this huge collision between two classes, where the new class thrive on being social, and they gain their power by being social. And of course, just like the bourgeoisie desired a very different art from the old feudal structure with the aristocracy, when it was basically about decorating kings, then the bourgeoisie created what we consider modern art. And I'm totally convinced that the new autocracy, whether we like it or not, will strive for a new art form. And to begin with, the art of the individual is dead because the individual is dead. So the art of the individual is a collective effort. So co-creation of art is what's at the center here. And then we need to put this art into context. Where can this art be art? Where can it be art with a capital A? Where can it be more than just objects? Because the concept of art is something different from objects in general. And will that have a place in this society? And I said, yes, it will. It will be sacred. and it would be collective. And rather than decorating a king or decorating an industrialist who owns factories, it's an art form, it's an art that has to decorate the collective effort. So it will be very ritualistic, it will be very shamanistic. And I see early adoptions of this, for example, at the Burning Man Festival in America with 60,000 participants every year. Now the Burning Man phenomenon is exploding around the world. We have lots of different smaller Burning Mans around the world. And people are just leaving everything they have. They go there, they spend lots of money, they don't make any money from going there, and they do it as a huge communal, collective effort. And whether the artistic quality is good or not, we can discuss that. It's still an attempt, an early attempt at co-creating a new form of social art far, far away from British Cool Britannia galleries. And that's what I find so healthy.
I'll try to answer this too, even though you asked him. There was one reason that the philosophers were sort of interested in art. There was this transgressive notion that was going on. And especially if we're going to talk about this tradition, Nietzsche's probably the one who was thinking about it. It breaks down. I actually a little bit disagree with you about what the internet does because of that and what it means for art. Because what happens, I think, in the internet is that there are these micro communities that start to come up. But the micro communities are always like a Venn diagram. There's some overlap with other ones and overlaps with other ones. So in some ways, you're drifting all over these micro economies, micro theoretical positions, micro dialogues into the internet. And that's why it's what becomes sort of interesting. So it's exactly what this breakdown that Benjamin's thinking about. In some ways, all interpretations, all ways of putting the information together are equally valid. Because we're not going to know which one of these sets you're coming from. And of course, it means that all paradigms are up for grabs. And that's what's sort of interesting about art and a little bit interesting about the internet, because it's not only showing you paradigms, it's showing you how paradigms are constructed, what therefore paradigms leave out in information and what put in. And a lot of artwork exactly does that. Here's a new paradigm, therefore look at the other things that are happening in the, what? Maybe we can say the sensual surface of it or whatever. But it's never going to be, I think, sacred because of that. It's always going to be one more interpretation is possible. As even Duchamp said, n+1. Artwork is always n+1. Here's the interpretation plus one other interpretation. But then when n+1, you get another n+1. So it kind of works like this. But we've stayed a lot of time on this thing. So.
Now I gotta post him. Yeah. I think what's important to stress, though, I'm not opposing so much as telling a different story. We have to start something called network dynamics. And network dynamics is a huge topic these days, simply because of the internet. And what's interesting with network dynamics is it doesn't look at the internet as, you know, Google, Facebook, certain phenomena that pop up every 2 or 3 years. It looks over the long run. It looks what does the internet do to people over, say, 50, 100, 150 years. And the interesting thing with network dynamics is that you're absolutely right. Right now, the internet is what's called a subcultural phenomenon. It's tiny micro-communities. And you go from one to the next, and you jump around, and you try out, and they overlap. That's exactly what they do. But at the end of the day, you come to a point where this becomes extremely frustrating, and that's what's interesting. And then you start to realize that you also become more comfortable being in certain micro-communities, because you've been there for a few years. And you have a certain status within those communities, and you have what's called a individual identity within those communities. So you have a certain credibility that goes with your name. And what then happens is that these communities start to look at the bigger picture. They step back and start to look at the bigger picture. And the visionaries will then say, what happens if we connect certain subcultures with each other in a grander subculture? And that's what happens. And we already see that happening now. I would say, again, referring to the Burning Man Festival is a perfect example. There are actually very few people who go to the Burning Man webpage every day and communicate with other burners. Only a few people do that. Because Burning Man is actually a whole set of subcultures that reconnect with each other every year. And then that materializes through the manifestation of Burning Man, which is in itself a very interesting work of art. Because you lock up 60,000 people in the desert for 8 days and then they leave and don't leave a single trace. Very Tibetan. But then they retreat So what do burners do the other 11 months of the year when they're not preparing directly for or participating in Burning Man? They go back to subcultures that all relate to the Burning Man activity. And in this way, we're seeing a new society where subcultures relate to other subcultures in cultures. And these new virtual cultures are extremely powerful. And this is precisely where art comes in. Because in a society where so much communication and so much information, the only thing that can gel people together and make them feel like they belong together when there's too much information around is art. It's through symbols. It's through looking at a cross or something. It's through symbols that you feel, yeah, I'm part of this too. And then you see a stranger next to you and he's part of it too. And then you can start connecting with each other. And that's exactly a very functional purpose for art in this new environment, where I think art will explode and be very, very powerful. Again, symbols can do what language can't do. It can connect where language fails. And that's what art does.
Oh no, I have to answer. Because I disagree so much. Because I think what's happening with exactly this is that art, because it starts to show these multiplicity of meanings, that each of us have this possibility, it's the breakdown of the hierarchies. It's finally when communication can take place, because that means none of us have a privileged position in regard to the information. Art pieces are a non-privileged positioning. So therefore, it's not this one place you want to be. It's that each of us, and this, Cezanne actually talks about it in one of his introductions, that all knowledge is individual. Each of us have the knowledge. And this is exactly what, that's funny to come back to Benjamin, talking, each of us have a theory of the art piece that's adequate. Everybody has one, period. And this is where, to talk about in-between spaces, liminal spaces, the Turner, the person that developed the idea, he said, in a society, there's always going to be hierarchies, therefore communication cannot happen. Because people that are higher on the hierarchy have a more privileged position. The only time is if we suspend all that. That's this individual thing, that's this multiplicity. Therefore, an art piece is that non-privileged position. It isn't this sort of thing. So I actually a little bit disagree.
Well, to me that sounds very utopian and very sweet, but that's not how it works. You know, it's different hierarchies, and again, you can also perfectly well think of a society where actually the capacity to communicate is what creates hierarchies. We're differently skilled when it comes to communication. For example, you don't speak Swedish. So if I would move on to Swedish right now, you'd be excluded. And there'd be hierarchy in this room where you would be at the end of it, and I'd be at the top of it with the other participants who speak Swedish. Just to give you a perfect example of what hierarchy does and how it works. I think at the end of the day, I think it's kind of naive to think that there's like a non-hierarchical position in relation to art, and that art somehow is involved with that. Although I'm not quite getting it. But I would say I'm interested in what art has for what kind of function art has, and then once we realize what function art has, then we have to start looking at from political level. Is this the desired function of art, or is this something we have to subvert? Because when art creates rather than takes down hierarchy, then I perfectly agree. Then we have to think of what are we up to? What's going on here? For example, when the king decorates himself, that's definitely art in the service of hierarchy rather than opposed to hierarchy. So I'm political in the sense that I want art to be inclusive, I want art to be democratic, I want art to be open, I want art to be for everyone, and I'm a huge fan of Jeff Koons, so I like the idea that art is accessible, and it's accessible as a principle. I agree with Zizek. But I'm not sure that's how it works. I'm not sure that how it functions or will function, because I don't think we live in a non-hierarchical society. We just have new kinds of hierarchy, and the hierarchies today are not between individuals. The hierarchies today are much rather between networks. Different networks have more or less power. If you work inside the Google building, or if you're a farmer in Nigeria, you probably have two very, very different sets of networks in the network society. So I would caution against naivety when it comes to what the internet does to power structures.
Okay.
I made my position.
If we don't have anything from the audience, we can move on to another statement.
That
question
here.
I completely agree with a lot of things that Alexander says, because I also see this paradigm shift we're facing. Because of climate change, because of other threats or whatever, with the end of the hyper-focused egocentric world we're facing. But I see the role of art in this very much as art has the tools to prototype or create or evolve the visions of the next society or where we're going, and can be sort of, you know, aid the process. And I would like to see the art world not only focusing on criticizing the society of today, but be more visionary and help the transition towards this new future.
And I totally agree with you. And I see a new role for art there, because art has been the subversive instrument for, say, the past 50, 100 years during postmodernism, the questioning, which has been its strength. And the Foucauldian idea of life as a work of art has taken hold. But I think we're moving now from hyper-individualism into a state of a much stronger interest in the collective. You're absolutely right, I forgot about that. Climate change and the huge political issues that we're confronted with, that we have to solve together in a communal effort, also means that people who don't want to be involved in that process are actually betrayers. And we have to actually be political about that too. And I think this is where political art has a huge role to play. And it's a very, very, very much I'm looking forward to collective effort. I think collective art has a strong 20, 30 years ahead of it, definitely.
I'll say yes. That was what I was trying to get with this utopian model, which was so that in some ways is pointing in a direction, it's hoping to point in a direction where we can reassess this, say, kind of have a logic of a new system. So I think there is an attempt at that, and I've already mentioned Deleuze. The Anti-Oedipus is in a postmodern logic. It's an attempt to try and do this where we can break down this old network and try to rebuild something in a more utopian method. So I think there is an attempt at it. It's not just critical, but the critical has this aspect of before we can create, we have to destroy in some ways. So this is happening. So.
Okay. If there's anything more, speak now, or else I will read the next statement, which is political correctness equals cultural Marxism.
Steven.
I don't even know where to start with this one, because I feel like I should define what Marxism is here. There was a big problem. There was a problem because Marxian believed in a historical materialism, and so it was basically this base, the relations of productions and the modes of production, this really material thing that generated consciousness. So we were all kind of trapped there. Many other people like Gramsci started to think, well, maybe the ideology and the institutions that are generated from there can actually then have an effect on it. A real Marxist, a real material Marxist would say, no, all consciousness comes from material, period. So if I was going to, it depends on where I'm going to place myself on this superstructure or base thing. So I just lay out the conditions of that whole thing. And read the question one more time.
Political correctness equals cultural Marxism.
I think it's the cultural world that says no. Because inside of institutions and inside cultural apparatuses, there's drift, there's not, there's gaps, there's drifts, there's contradictions, there's all sorts of things that are going on. And once you can use that at some sort of ideal level, then you can sort of pry at the material base. I think it is possible. I think some people think so, but like I said, a very hardcore Marxian. And this was one of the problems that happened with postmodernism, why it wasn't accepted very strongly in some countries. That they would say, well, the problem is they think that consciousness is at a different level than the material base. So I think in some ways that doesn't have to be the case.
I find it very interesting because the statement assumes that political correctness would be okay if it wasn't cultural Marxism, because world cultural Marxism is disgusting. I'm the other way around. I don't have a problem with cultural Marxism. I actually think Marxism is at its best when it goes cultural. The problem is that I'm an economist, and most experiments at creating Marxist societies have not been economically very successful, simply because it simply doesn't drag the bad sides out of human beings that need to be dragged out for them to be efficient. People tend to be lazy, inefficient, and corrupt when they live in Marxist economies. That's my problem with Marxism. I love the idea of Marxism. I'm looking for the return of utopia desperately. I think the theology project that also Zizek loves is the better project than try to create a new Cuba. But I don't have a problem with cultural Marxism. I think actually if there's one thing we should do with our tax money, it's to put it into culture. Call it education if you like, but if there's one thing we should really invest in, it's the future of our children. And what do our children need? They need fresh air to breathe, they need fresh water to drink, they need food to eat, and they need fucking culture, so they don't become stupid idiots. So cultural Marxism I love. My problem then is with political correctness. So I would say, if I would be nasty to cultural Marxists, I would say they're politically correct. And I'm tired of political correctness, and I'm also tired of political incorrectness, which is even more tiresome. For example, American Republicans, who use the hatred of political correctness as an excuse of being Nazis and fascists and homophobic and all kinds of stupid things, and mindless in general. But I think we're paying a price for political correctness in the sense that people have become oversensitive to words, even to the point where it's becoming counterproductive. Zizek has a point here. Zizek says that there is a point in not allowing people to say certain things. Even if we can't change their minds, and we shouldn't try to change their minds, we will eventually change their minds by refusing to let them use certain words. But we can also come to a point where this whole process becomes so counterproductive that we get what Nietzsche would hate, which is a culture of offense. And I wouldn't say political correctness so much is the problem as the culture of offense. People taking offense all the time. And I did an experiment myself, kind of artistic in this sense, this last fall. It so happens that my older brother, who I love dearly, is black. Black is the politically correct word for that. And he calls me the faggot in the family, and I call him the Negro in the family. So I said this in an interview. I said, well, my brother, my lovely brother, who's saving the world in Africa because he's black, and he went back to Africa to his roots, and he's a very wonderful person. He calls me the faggot of the family, so I call him the Negro of the family. And immediately the phone lines started heating up everywhere, and people started calling, and there was this hatred thing about Alexander Bard being a racist on Facebook with thousands of followers and all that. And I just get so fucking fed up with the whole thing. I said, how stupid can you get? How can they call me a racist? I sat on a damn TV show and expressed my love to my brother. I even want to have incest with him. That's how much I love him. You know, and my point is that if I use the word faggot, then I'm also allowed to use the word Negro and take what is obviously historically a very negative word and twist it around and give it power and empower people by using it. And I think this whole idea of artistically, creatively taking words and using them and gain power instead of using them again and again and again to take offense and to make yourself a victim is a very, very different thing. And I think, again, we're thinking too much short-term, we're reacting too much to things short-term instead of thinking long-term. And language is definitely something we should approach long-term.
Okay. Is there anything... Okay. Then we move on. With power comes corruption, and that is good.
Why am I thinking of Putin? I had an argument with one of these few Russians that are left, few reasonably intelligent Russians that are left who still love Putin yesterday, and he gave me this old story of, well, you know, without Putin we wouldn't have saved Russia in the 1990s. I said, well, it's actually the oil price that saved Russia. Come on, not Putin. He didn't do that. Power and corruption is good? No, corruption is never good. Corruption to me is what happens to people when they become short-sighted, narcissistic, individualistic, and scared. And it's essentially what you do when you rob the social, you rob society from something and keep it to yourself because you're afraid if you don't do that, you're not going to survive. And actually, if we're going to build a civilization, I happen to like civilizations. then corruption is always the biggest enemy. And the lower level of corruption you have in a society, the more you can actually, the more everybody benefits from social activities. So I would say, no, corruption is not good to begin with. But power corrupts, yes. And the only tool we've experienced, I'm very pragmatic here, the only tool we've experienced throughout history to stop people from going corrupt when they get power is to kick them out of office as quickly as possible. So make sure there are different centers, the different choices, the different centers of power in any given society. Oligopolies and monopolies are always the enemy.
Yes, I agree with that. The only thing is one of the points you made before about why communism failed, this is why. Because once you put anybody in charge, they become corrupt. So they ended up taking basically the spoils, just like it does in a capitalist system, which we're seeing now, exactly with the 1%. So, but if I can read corruption just from the normal sense of the word, absolutely. We need to have, there has to be a system in place that, speaking of the hierarchy once again, that no matter where you are on the hierarchy, the same rules apply to you, period. It has to be the way, otherwise corruption's, and that's what exactly happens in all societies. This is what starts to happen.
And speaking of art here, it's very important to realize that art is under the same rules as everything else in a given society. Whatever we consider to be quality of art or the creativity of art, it will always be bigger and always be more fascinating if we have an open society with lots of different centers. And as soon as art is centralized, it dies. It's a given.
Okay. Is there anything from the... Yep.
I would think this would relate to the previous statement about political correctness and cultural Marxism, and this idea that the corruption from power, all that actually does is show what power actually is. And what political correctness does is allows power to hide behind a political correctness. You know, you can justify living in a capitalist society that exploits the third world, because when you go to Starbucks, you buy the fair trade coffee. And so you can live with the exploitation associated with oil, but, you know, you're nice to the coffee farmers. So that political correctness allows you to say, I'm not part of this evil power structure. But then maybe cultural Marxism is just applying the critical power of Marxism to culture and just exposes these power structures at work and the ideology that allows them to work. And so perhaps it's better to see corruption because it just shows you the naked face of power. And, you know, to think of power that's not corrupt is in itself a corruption.
Slavoj Žižek's work is exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about ideology here. And as soon as I hear somebody saying they're liberal, I'm not a liberal by my... If anybody believes, I'm not a liberal at all. I'm probably a really ardent socialist, but I'm a pragmatist. So, but, Deleuzian socialist. Yeah, but anyway, Slavoj Žižek's critique is wonderful in this sense, and that's where his oeuvre is so great. Because as soon as I talk to somebody who says they're reasonably intelligent and call themselves liberal, then I said, you haven't read Žižek yet. If you read Žižek, you won't call yourself liberal anymore. Because you will realize that what capitalist society does is that it gives us all these different words, these different concepts to use as an excuse for not seeing the blatant truth. But you're making one wrong assumption there, I would say, and that is when you equalize corruption and power, you say they're stable, and they're not. Power, if you have 100 units of power, it doesn't mean you automatically have 100 units of corruption. What you have is that you have 100 units of power, and there tends to be very little corruption when you get the power. But then, as you keep the power, corruption tends to increase until you lose that power. So, circulating power is a means of minimizing corruption. Having different centers competing for power is also a way of minimizing corruption. But a capitalist society always goes towards monopoly or oligopoly unless you control that. That's exactly where socialism comes in, and where socialism's most important function in society always is to hit at monopolies and oligopolies and destroy them. And that's what you have to do through political mechanisms against the market. So I would say, no, corruption is not constant, and corruption is not given, and there is an idea of a servant who has power. It's called priest. And even if the Catholic priests of today are very corrupt, after 2,000 years in the same offices and they haven't been questioned, especially not by the Polish ladies who still believe in them even if they fuck their children. There's still the possibility, there's still a role in history for the servant priest as the holder of power, actually who holds it responsibly. And that's the power that gives and supports rather than steals. And if you go to smaller communes, you often find these people there who are interested in the local community where they actually want to do some good. And in that sense, I even herald, and I love politicians actually dare to be politicians. There are good politicians. There are a few of them, they're not many, but they are there, and they're not corrupt.
I'll back up. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, makes a distinction between violence and power. And what she says there is that what you're talking about, power, isn't power, it's violence. Power is this actually communal thing, when we all sort of agree that's where the real power is. And I think she's gotten this one strain that we were talking about with the Nietzsche thing. Power isn't I'm controlling everybody, therefore I have power. Power is the ability to kind of create and try and do something new. And all of this is kind of being trapped in some sort of psychosis that was earlier talked about. You're kind of circulating through the same things. You might be destroying another country and getting lots of money while you do it, but it's a problematic. So my reading of it is a little bit about this. Maybe you're not, this power thing you're talking about is maybe this sort of other kind of notion that I have the life and death of another country. I can, you know, destroy their environment. And that's a violence. That's a violence and not actually a power, I would say. So the other thing is this cultural Marxism. I'm not really sure what we're talking about here. I'm not really sure what that is, because I understand that, like I said, this base and superstructure thing, and the culture is somehow resting on this superstructure, but I'm not really sure what we're meaning by it. So I wondered if there was any kind of explanation when you put this question together.
No, I'm just
suspicious.
I have a suggestion for formulating cultural Marxism. A cultural Marxist is a reasonably intelligent person interested in the arts and creativity, who thinks it's not a good idea that rich people become richer and poor people become poorer. And who would like to see art try to heal that divide rather than make it even bigger. That's a cultural Marxist, I would say.
Okay, somebody who...
Decent people, basically.
The ideology that is generated from the contradictions of capitalism. Okay, very good. But I don't know if this kind of answers the question. This is a really fascinating question, but my problem is I want a definition of all the terms. And then when I define them, I want to run off in a different direction. So I might be a bit frustrating, but I want to say one thing, so, you know, I've been going through this kind of Nietzschean and Hegelian thing, is the will to power for Nietzsche, for instance, isn't that somehow I'm in charge of people. It is that I can create constantly new systems. I am the meaning maker, i.e., that's why he loved art. They are the penultimate, the great artists are the ultimate expression of will to power. They are going to make a different system. So they're not going to be trapped, oh, I proved to myself I'm worthy, I have money. Huh? That's somebody else's system. You have to build your own. So he would reject that entirely. And that's always kind of interesting in colleges where you get these frat boys who think they're Supermen, Nietzschean Supermen. It's like, how much don't you understand here? So I think this is the thing about this power thing and this cultural thing. It really is he's grabbed a hold of, because he thinks in some ways once we get there, once we get to this position, true power, true meaning, true humanity can be expressed. And so if we can take the Marxist thing as well, on top of being constructed by your society, you in another way transcend it. You can see these, and of course this is the gaps and contradictions and all of that, suddenly you become aware of. You somehow have a different form of consciousness, not just generated from this this base system. I could tell you what an answer to that.
I agree.
Okay.
Next statement.
Bad art and no art are the real art.
This is a really interesting question, because the thing about, this thing about making art where you're replicating a system that's already in place, means that a real art is kind of invisible. It's kind of dealing with some sort of unconscious, some sort of organization that's totally new. You're putting things together, a new paradigm in a way. So in some ways, all good art is invisible. It somehow can't be seen. And every time you try to build it, you're kind of plunging into those unarticulated, inarticulated, unarticulable things. And so in some ways, yes, I would say this invisibility. And you see it sometimes in art. You see it. What is John Cage doing with the chants? How to delve into the no art, the nothing. Get this place where there is. Balka, who did What It Is at the Turbine Hall, you go into a room and you see blackness, and it's called What It Is. So it's suddenly, this is confronting this thing, and because once you confront that, once you confront this 0 point, then yes, then all of these systems are possible. But you've actually deconstructed the system you want to, that you came from. So I didn't get into the other art, but no art, yes.
I would say Stephen has just come out as a religious atheist. That's exactly what our theology is based on. The worship of atheists, the God that does not exist, as the empty space. Well, whatever. You don't like the word religion, I can tell that, yeah.
No God for me.
You're a different generation than I am. I've gone the whole Hegelian turn. I started to like it because it's sort of perverted and it's interesting and fascinating again. I'm tired of secularity. But anyway, back to the question, the statement. Can you repeat it?
Bad art and no art.
Yeah. Art can be brilliant for different reasons. Sometimes art is brilliant because of context. Sometimes you're just lucky as an artist. You're probably artistically quite mediocre, you don't have the eye for it, but all of a sudden you happen to construct something that has historical significance and importance. And we can sometimes see works of art from art history. There's only one work of art, actually, that's really meaningful and brilliant out of a whole oeuvre, and the rest is just crap. That can happen. Really brilliant artists will tend to do more than one piece, one work of art that becomes relevant and is held in high regard afterwards, and there's probably a reason for that. And after all, at the end of the day, you want art as much as possible independently to stand out and be really good. And here I agree with Stephen, because compared to, say, popular culture or mass duplication or whatever, then art should play directly into the subversive subconscious. It should be invisible in that sense. It shouldn't be obvious. It's often brilliant afterwards. Nietzsche is an artist in this sense as a philosopher. Nietzsche wasn't recognized as a philosopher until the 1920s, 30 years after he died. While he was still alive, he was considered a mad German poet. Because his philosophy was so groundbreaking, the way he conducted it was so different, uncompromising, and quality-driven, that he really didn't care whether people were interested or not. And I think, I'm a writer, I make popular music, yes, but I'm not an artist when I make music, but I'm an artist when I write. And I know that I'm really good at what I'm doing when I totally disregard how it's going to be received by others. When I'm totally focused on the art for its own sake in a relationship with me as the artist. And a really great art is there, and you somehow feel that this is playing into the back of your mind. It's going and it's subverting, and it's going into the subconscious, and it's slowly but surely changing the very basic fundamentals of life forever. And that's what really, really great art does. And in this sense, art, when it's really brilliant, is ahead of everything else that we humans do. It's at the forefront. It's what breaks first. Political art, when it's really, really good, doesn't say the obvious. Political art plays into something that disturbs us, that we haven't formulated yet, that we're not debating yet, that we haven't realized yet. But then we wake up long afterwards and realize, well, that was political. That really changed me, and that made me think.
Of course. And if we think of R. Mutt's urinal, the fountain, of course, it's exactly the case. It's like, whoa, what is that? So, I think once you grapple with the notion of this no art, then the bad art kind of goes with it. But also, there's one thing about morality. In some ways, art is going to have to question morality. It's going to be a constant question about it, and it's going to then do things that are on the edge continually. So not only, I think this is maybe more what you're thinking of when you think of bad art. It's going to be questionable, and I'm going to be a little upset by it. Of course, the urinal, the fountain by Armat, by Duchamp is one thing, but of course, a goldfish in a blender where I can turn it on, and I might be tempted. Oops. This is kind of playing this thing, and I think that's maybe a more thing, but of course it's going to be exactly this. It's going to have me start to question how I'm constructing that morality and what I can contribute or not. So it becomes these parameters of understanding that, and I think it's going to always be questioning it, and it comes back to this utopian question. Because of course the only way we can actually live in this sort of world that we hope a better one is we're going to start to question all these positions of morality and try to find some reason for it. So.
And me being an Hegelian autist, I love anything that forces me to think. And I wish I keep that attitude until the day I die. That's my basic premise for living. So, what's art's role in this? Like I said before, art is ahead of things. Art can do things before language can do them. And then, working with language myself, I know I get inspired by art. And then I formulate. So poets and philosophers always follow the artist in this sense. And that's the unique aspect of art that makes it really stand out, is the fact that it can be ahead of things. And if art then doesn't provoke me to think new ways, then it's bland and boring and mediocre. It can be decorative, it can have other qualities, it can be quality. You know, if an artist, let's assume that an artist says that I'm only doing decorative art. Well, that could be interesting as a decoration, whatever, you know. Okay, then some modern king would walk along, buy it, put it on himself to have even more sex. That's what kings do. That's what art was for originally. But to me today, if I would be an art critic, I would definitely ask myself, am I being provoked by this or not? Am I being forced to think new, to think fresh, to think differently, to, in a Hegelian sense, thinking thoughts for themselves about themselves is always a constant process, but it's not the same process. It's always a return of the slightly different, in a Nietzschean sense. And that's where art plays in. Really, really good art does exactly that. And it has to be provocative. It has to be provocative. If it doesn't provoke us to think differently than we did before we walked into a gallery or whatever, then it's mediocre.
Anything from the audience? Okay. I will read my last statement, and we have a quarter to discuss it. And yes, let's get on with it. Art does not forget, neither does it forgive.
Art is about forgetting and forgiving continually.
That's a Nietzschean statement. That was very Nietzschean said of you. No,
I mean, it plays into what we've been talking about already. I mean, in some ways, this idea that there's a multiplicity of ways of constructing the world. There is not single. This is the propaganda idea, the single point perspective. To see the world from this one place is to really understand it. No, there is no position like that in the world, and art in some ways wants to replicate that, explore it, put together new systems. It's a continual process. Therefore, in some ways, it's a continual forgetting. It's a continual forgetting. And if anything, I wish when we go into a museum and we read the text on the wall and then we look at the artwork, we could forget what that curator just wrote. A little while ago, the very first Wounds show that Elliot did at the Moderna here, if those that remember the Wounds show, in order to go into the gallery, he had built a wall that you couldn't see into the show at first. So in order to enter the first room, you had to go past this wall, but on this wall was a gigantic text explaining to you what you were going to see. He structured the entire exhibition on that wall. And it was everything I could do. Do not look. To go past that wall and not to be structured by what he was going to do. This is what we have to do contingently. Of course, it might be that we can see things differently by somebody prodding us in a direction, but that doesn't, as Nietzsche would say, once again, and Zizek would say, that doesn't leave us open. We still have a responsibility to try and construct a meaning of that art piece. It's a responsibility. It's not just a, oh, here we are. You've got to do it. You've got to work at it. It's what you're dealing with here. So that's what the forgetting part is. And the forgiving part, of course, yes. It's, you always have to be forgiven that you made a position before that was incorrect, that you were going to narrow down the meaning of that artwork to one thing when it's asking you to not do that. So you have to, oh, I forgive myself for believing that's what it was before, and now I believe it's this. Oh, I forgive myself because now it's this, not that. It's a continual thing, I think, so. Yeah, I can explain my Nietzschean comment.
Yeah, everything's in process, in movement. Very good. I totally agree on that one. I'll focus on, because I totally agree with what Steven just said, I'm going to focus on another aspect of the words of forgiving and forgetting, and put things into historical context. We were talking about ideology before, in the Zizek'ian sense, which fascinates me endlessly because that's the big problem with the times we live in. Well, people don't realize how ideological everything is these days, and how it's actually one ideology that totally dominates us so fiercely. I think one of the things Zizek hasn't mentioned yet in his work, I've written about it, it's a phenomenon that I call generationism. We obviously understand what racism is. Racism is that you hate people who look different from you. If they have a different skin color or eye color, whatever, than you have, you can hate them. And that's called racism. And we don't like racism. We've been taught that racism is a bad thing, but we've also been taught that racism is a natural reaction, sociobiological, etc. This is something we have to overcome and fight with all the time. This is Foucault's idea of drinking a cup of tea and smoking a joint in the morning and then fighting the fascist within you every morning of your life. And that's what we all should do. We should fight the racist within us because we should fight the fascist within us. The person who's scared of others and who likes to hate others. That's a constant struggle we all have to go through every day. And we should. And our children should too. But generationism is the aspect of this that we constantly forget. Generationism is the idea that your generation, the people who live now, are superior to people who lived in the past. We're somehow smarter today, we're more intelligent, we're more tolerant, we live in a better world, etc., etc. And most of this is just rubbish. Actually, human beings use a smaller part of the brain today than they did 5,000 years ago, because things have become automatic, technology has moved information outside of our heads, we actually use our brains less than we used to. That means we tend to assume things less critically than we used to. That makes us more stupid than previous generations, not smarter. And I think it takes a certain humility here, humbleness, towards history. I always try to teach people history. Read history, read history. The beginning of intelligence and the beginning of understanding is history. And learn from history and don't repeat the mistakes of history. And the general mistake of history that always returns again and again and again is the idea that somehow now history is fixed. Now we arrived at a point that we know how things work. Everything's going to stay the same. The borders of the United States and Sweden and India are going to stay the same forever. There are never going to be any more wars because the borders that are there now are logical, which is where ideology operates. Of course, none of the borders on the map are logical. They're just the results of power struggles over the years that have been happening over hundreds of years, and they can change again. Because some people give birth to more children than others do to begin with. So I think generationism is an aspect of current ideology that's really, really scary. And this is where we have to remember where the words forgiving and forgetting come into play. Nietzsche says forgetting is something we lose out on. Yes, that's exactly right, because we're forgetting the wrong things. We're not remembering the right things and we're forgetting the wrong things. And forgetting things that will destroy you, destruct you inwards, that will cloud in your heart is what you should forget about. But what you shouldn't forget about is history and mistakes done in the past, because the one advantage we have in civilization and from having a written history is that we can learn from other mistakes and don't repeat them. And that's what we should do. So, being respectful towards history, realizing that we are just as intolerant today as people were 400 years ago. I'll give you a perfect example. Most people, if you walk out here on the Swedish square, most people out there would say that, oh, people were awful 500 years ago. They would throw women into rivers in Sweden, and if the women would float, they would call them witches and burn them to death. And if they would drown, they would say, well, she drowned, so what? She could have been a witch. So they would kill women all the time and call them witches. They were so horrible. We're not like that today, aren't we? How do we treat drug addicts? How do we treat immigrants? Wait a second, you know, the level of evil is probably constant over time. That's a good starting point, a very Foucauldian starting point. And I think this is where generation comes into play. So what we're forgiving, what we're forgetting, and what art plays into this is a humbleness towards history, understanding that our generation is probably no better than previous generations were. We're probably more stupid than they were. We're more naive than they were. And generationism is just as evil as racism is. We just don't talk about it. Because the older generations aren't there to speak up for them. And they'd be furious with us if they were.
Anything from the audience? Or do you want, Steven?
No, I would love to see some questions.
Okay.
I really can't agree with what you're saying. Oh, sorry. I really can't agree with what you're saying about generations being as... I mean, we're much more informed these days about... Like, we have accessibility to history now and to science. And what is a generation if not like a piece of human history in a certain time with a certain experience?
Do you seriously think Wikipedia is the peak of civilization? You have access to information in your pocket. That's your pocket. That's not your head.
No, but I definitely think some generations are much worse, and I think that we can like change.
No. I think your problem starts right there. That's exactly what generationism is. It's the same thing as saying that white people are superior to black people. People today are superior to people who lived 100 years ago. That's exactly the mistake of generationism. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not even being discussed. This is just as nasty as racism is. And the problem with that, the price you pay for thinking you're superior to previous generations, is that you think more highly of yourself than you should. You think you're smarter than you actually are. You think because you have Wikipedia in your cell phone in your pocket, you're somehow more intelligent than a person who actually read books. But you're not. And this scares me. This is what scares me about this age. It's what scares me about teenagers today. They don't realize how fucked up they are. By ideology and by the technologies they use. That's what I've been trying to say for the past 50 years through my work. No? We need the Frankfurt School more than ever. I just read Andrew Keene's new book, Digital Vertigo, last week. It's coming out in May. Andrew Keene is a dear friend of mine. It's the first really good attempt at doing the Frankfurt School applied on the internet society. And he knows Walter Benjamin, he knows Cis Marcuse, he knows the guys really, really well. And it's an American attempt, it's just the beginning of that. But I think a social critique of the internet from the inside, not by people who hate the internet, anything banal like that, but rather people who from the inside realize what a hydra it is and that it creates Al-Qaeda as much as it creates Facebook. Then I think that's exactly what we need more than anything in literature right now. It's a social critique of the internet society.
Anything? Anyone?
I have a question, but you're basically, what you went to say, if I can do this, is that may be, however, the access is more available to a larger number, and inside of a hierarchy, there's not an upper class that has access to the information. We all have it. Therefore, there is something better about this generation. Okay.
You haven't read my book, Stephen. You would know that in the Netocracy versus Concentraria theory, we're just creating new classes. Because it's not access to information that gives you power. What gives you power now is how you sort that information and who you give it to. And certain networks are more powerful than others, and that's exactly why we have a new class society ahead of us. And instead of looking at, for example, I'll give you, Traditional sociology measures income and wealth as measures of class. So you would go to a suburb in southern Stockholm and you'd find a Somalian family with a cab driver and 3 people unemployed, and they have a low income and low wealth, so they would be the underclass according to classic sociology. Now, if you use internet sociology instead, where you measure actually the use of interactive technologies rather than measuring income and wealth, you get a totally different picture. Then you get an underclass in Sweden, where the new underclass is a 35-year-old man born in Sweden, living in Hällefors kommun in central Sweden, being unemployed, overweight, eating potato chips, porn surfing on the internet with 14 Facebook friends on average, and they probably just forced their old relatives or something, because nobody wants to communicate with him. And that's the new underclass. This is a new class society, and we can't be so naive that we think class is going to disappear or hierarchy is out the window. It's just a new set of hierarchies. Hierarchies are being repeated. Technology doesn't make us nicer or tougher. It doesn't change us in that sense. We're still human beings. And unfortunately, human beings tend to differentiate themselves into different classes because they have different sets of talents. And the job of politics and of art, political art, is to mediate and encourage and strengthen those beneath, those in the underclass. That's what political art should always do. And political art today, in Sweden, is endorsing the Somali taxi driver. It's not endorsing the 35-year-old guy born in Sweden who's unemployed, overweight, eating potato chips, porn surfing in central Sweden. You know, the girls have left the town. They're all living in Stockholm now, getting educations. This is the new underclass, the consumtariat. And nobody wants to talk about it. People are totally uncomfortable with it because this is the new underclass in the internet society. The people being left out by the new interactive technologies. And they feel left out, they're depressed, they kill themselves. Hey, that's exactly what Karl Marx would call an underclass in 2012. It's no longer income and wealth we should measure, actually, to find class. The really strong class differentiator today is the use of interactive technologies, which enables people to be powerful or disqualifies them from power.
And with that being said, I think we're out of time. And I would like to thank you, Alexander, and thank you, Steven, so much for coming. And I hope Mark is all right somewhere in the transport system. And thank you so much for you guys for showing up. And we'll continue in studio now, because it's 7, I think. Or it's a little over, or some, yeah. Okay, so studio it is now. Thank you.